What is it about the abortion debate that raises temperatures so high, do you think?
It's an emotive issue, and it hasn't been helped by the fact that those who are passionate and those in the media want to frame it as a pro-life, pro-choice issue. I mean, the fact of the matter is most Australians believe that there should be more support for people who find themselves in unplanned pregnancy. Most people believe that very late-term abortion is wrong because it ends a human life. And then there's an area in the middle, particularly in the early stages of pregnancy, where there are reasonable people who can disagree. But to treat it as a polarising issue, you know, if you're not for it, you're against it, rather than working constructively to better support people who face this vulnerability, I think does great harm. It brings out the nutters on both sides rather than allowing it to be the kind of issue where sensible people get together and do what we all know is in the interests of vulnerable women and, importantly, vulnerable babies.
Well said, well said. Now let's talk about housing in Queensland. Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk held a roundtable conference in Brisbane on Friday. Amanda, who was there and what did they achieve?
It's a funny thing, isn't it? Last week on Tuesday, Premier Palaszczuk announces an October summit on housing and a roundtable you've referred to last Friday. At the roundtable, stakeholders and the Premier and the Minister got together and they were supposed to be talking through solutions to what is a real shortage of housing for people who need to rent and particularly rent at the lower price point here in Queensland. Now, that all sounds good on paper, but it doesn't take into account a couple of important things. The first is, if the Premier and the Minister don't know what the issues are in this field 7 years into government, well, then quite frankly, they're incompetent. They have one job in this field, one job, and they're not doing it. In fact, it's got mighty worse. The next thing to say is that while in one breath they're talking about a housing crisis that they're committed to fixing, just a few days before, in a previous breath, they were changing the rules for land tax that had the effect of reducing the supply of rental property available in Queensland. And that is just one of a succession of policies that have been brought into effect by Queensland Labor that are making housing more expensive, in shorter supply and less accessible to the most needy people in our community.
Well, tell us more about those policies. I mean, how is the government, for example, restricting supply of new housing?
So the supply of new housing is being constrained in a number of ways. The obvious one is that they're not releasing the land for development in the project home estates that so often ring our cities. And they're really important for people who either work in those areas or who aspire to get onto the property ladder in a house they can build themselves. And that just isn't an option, oftentimes closer to the city. But there are other less obvious ways that their policies are harming. I mentioned changes to land tax. What Labor have done in what they might think is a canny political move is to say that everyone who isn't a Queenslander, who invests in Queensland property as well as elsewhere, will have the decision about whether or not they're eligible, whether they fit under the tax-free threshold, and the rate at which they pay land tax assessed on the basis of the property they own everywhere, not just in Queensland. And this is a radical change. And its practical effect is to charge people who aren't Queenslanders higher rates of land tax.